very much a sort of totem, a symbolic idea, one of Labour's commitment to socialism, and certainly the comrades in the Clause 4 campaign argued that and were very keen to have it established as that sort of pattern. The other areas I'd like to talk about, particularly the impact of the Russian Revolution on both Clause 4, but perhaps more importantly at the conference in 1918 when Clause 4 was adopted. A number of other policy programs were also introduced, Labour and the New Social Order, and something that's often overlooked is the reorganization of the Labour Party, in particular the introduction of individual membership and a slight shifting away from its federal nature. A lot of the documents that I've put up on the website are original copies, and they may be difficult to look at, but they are well worth going through. I think the other important thing that should come out in the talk, but also in the wider discussion, is that 1917 is very much, I think, a dividing line in socialist and Labour movement history, or at least the beginnings of a dividing line, which by the middle 1920s is going to become very apparent. And of course, the Russian Revolution does lead to quite a fundamental division in the Labour movement, particularly about conceptions of socialism, the nature of socialism, and the means by which socialism is going to be achieved. And this, of course, means that in Britain, discussions on the Russian Revolution and what it means for the British Labour movement will have an international significance. By dividing line, probably in the most graphic case, it's a line drawn in blood. In Germany, the leaders of the German SPD, Scheidemann, Ebert and Noske, participated in a government and provisional government which in a sense led directly to the murder of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. And that line between German socialists and communists was a line drawn in blood, and it was more than just, I think, an ideological division in that way. But this is the importance, I think, of the Russian Revolution, and I think we can see that reflected in Clause 4. Above all, in terms of the British Labour Party, it clarifies or starts to begin the process of clarification about the nature of what we might call Labour's socialism, and in particular how far socialism could be achieved through Parliament, whether socialism was possible through Parliament, and it led on to wider discussions on whether the strategy had to be extra parliamentary, and I suppose the idea of what socialism actually is. For many in the Labour Party, for example, in the period of Herbert Morrison in the 1940s, socialism is what a Labour government does, which of course is a very ambiguous formulation, meaning both that socialism is the aim of a Labour government, but also the definition of socialism is limited to the type of policies that a Labour government can obtain through Parliament. And in that sense, is possibly a reformist conception of socialism. So those are some points that I'd like to raise. As ever, how I see these things going is that in discussing the history, some of the contemporary points will come through. Also, I also hope that it will be a cumulative process, and all the way through the course, as it were, that the questions will occur, and we will gain knowledge of these particular questions. So I'd like to begin looking at the impact of the First World War on the British Labour movement. Like all Labour movements, the British Labour Party and the British Labour movement was divided on the question of the war. Some of the leading members of the party were opposed to the war, often surprisingly. People who later we would consider to be on the right of the party were anti-war. Ramsay MacDonald is probably the most important of them. But many of the trade union leaders and many of the right of the party were were willing to support the war. Although initially, like other socialists, Labour did introduce or did proclaim an anti-war position. The document that is on the readings, the 1914 Manifesto Against War, is signed both by Ramsay MacDonald and Arthur Henderson. And at that stage, just 2 to 3 days before Britain participates in the war, they're still following the position of the Second International of opposition to an imperial war. But of course, what happens during the course of the war is that the bulk of the Labour movement gives a degree of critical support to the war, and in some cases, very enthusiastic support for the war. J.R. Clines, who is later going to become a Labour leader, is a supporter of the war. And as ever, many former left-wingers who previously had been strong anti-capitalists, such as Victor Grayson, turn into enthusiastic pro-imperialists and indeed lead recruiting meetings as well. One of the key points that I would like to stress, because I think it does have an impact on the development of Labour's conception of socialism, is that in the war, in all of the main belligerent countries, the role of the state changed considerably. So, for example, in Britain, a whole series of laws and controls over the economy and over society were introduced, from quite minor or possibly quite major areas of life, such as licensing laws, through to the nationalisation of the brewing industry in Carlisle, daylight saving, various repressive laws, the Munitions of War Act, the Defence of the Realm Act, which all restrict the right to strike, they restrict the right to oppose the war. Even conscription itself, which is introduced in 1916, these are all innovations in the way that the economy and society are handled. The trade union leaders are also directly incorporated into the state's efforts. Again, this is the first time that trade union leaders are encouraged to cooperate with the state to increase war production. They're given positions on committees to increase war production. So you have then a good example of a type of process that's going on throughout Europe. It's seen also in Germany as well, the role of the state, and in particular the control of the economy. And I think this, for many people, will later be a model for forms of what they refer to as nationalization and public ownership, a type of war economy and a type of direction of the economy. And that, I think, will be a model for some people's idea of socialism. But of course, there isn't only a support for the war amongst the trade union leaders. There's also very clear opposition, and that opposition takes many forms. For someone like Ramsay MacDonald, who is opposed to the war, this is a form of pacifism which grows out of the ethical socialism of the ILP that I described last week. It also, though, has some connections with previous liberal politics, and indeed in their critique of the war, certain leaders of the Labour Party, MacDonald's one of them, draw closer to a group of liberal international, so-called liberal internationalists, who formed the Union of Democratic Control, who argue that the imperialistic war is a product of secret diplomacy. And so aspects of Labour's foreign policy and its opposition are, I think, very clearly influenced by those earlier liberal approaches. As indeed there is a certain Little Englandism, which is a 19th century position of resisting entanglements in European wars and European conflicts. So the opposition to the war from some is very different from, say, those of Lenin, or even of the run-of-the-mill left-winger in Europe who is opposed to the idea of an imperialist war. There are many other different conceptions there. Alongside that, you get the emergence of opposition that grows in the trade unions, particularly at the rank and file level. And this leads to the creation of new forms of struggle against the Munitions of War Act, against the arrests of trade union militants, of rent strikes, particularly in Clydeside. So you're getting new forms of struggle emerging in the war itself. Again, I've cited some examples in the readings. Sylvia Pankhurst's anti-war campaign in the East End of London, which grew out of the women's suffrage movement and moved from being the Women's Suffrage Federation to being the Workers' Socialist Federation. And Sylvia Pankhurst was a very militant anti-war figure, and in contrast to her sisters, who had taken a very pro-war position as well. I've also included some examples of local shop stewards movements. Remember that this is the first time that the idea of the shop steward emerges, and it's the idea of a rank and file opposition, often to the bureaucratic form of trade union organization. Nowadays, the shop steward is an accepted part of the unions, or union rep, or whatever we might call them. But in this period, these are new and much more militant arrivals. There's a similar sort of development in Germany, particularly in Berlin, amongst metal workers. So again, you can see that the war throws up different forms of struggle, and in particular, the idea of workers' activity, and the idea that working class people can, in fact, defend their conditions, which the wartime governments are trying to undermine. And probably the most famous area, certainly for Britain, will be the struggles on Clydeside. And I've included some book reviews there. There's quite a massive material on Red Clydeside, and this will become important as we look at labour in the 1920s. So the war has, I think, two big effects. It changes the role of the state in society. It means that the state becomes much more oppressive, and it has clear controls over the economy. But it also leads to a response from workers and from socialists, both campaigning against the war and trying to put forward opposition to that repression. Much of this opposition begins to crystallize in reaction to the Russian Revolution. The first Russian Revolution in February 1917 is generally welcomed in Britain, and indeed it's welcomed by really the whole spectrum of the labour movement. The labour right, people like Arthur Henderson, believe that a democratic republic in Russia can help the war effort. Russia will continue to fight on the Allied side. But for others, the enthusiasm of the Russian Revolution, even before the October Revolution, the enthusiasm of that revolution is the idea of the Soviets, the idea of workers' councils, of direct representation of workers, both in struggle and as an alternative form of government. In June 1917, there was a convention, a conference held in Leeds, which discussed solidarity with that revolution, but also discussed some of the lessons. And again, in the readings, I've included a report of that, a contemporary report, both the actual conference report itself with speeches and the reports of the Manchester Guardian special correspondent. What I think is interesting about that is that, again, if we're looking at various ways of understanding the ferment, we can see that on one side, we've the idea of socialism as state control, a type of modernism, modernization and efficiency of the wartime economy. But then on the other hand, we've got this socialism from below, which is encapsulated in support for the Soviets. It's also very clear, though, that the idea, as the conference expresses it, of establishing Soviets in Britain is that the nature of the Soviet and whether it will challenge for power, whether it's a form of workers' government, is still not really very clearly understood. But if you look at the resolutions, you can see some of the debate there. And you can certainly see the idea that that existing politics, existing conceptions of socialism, need to be developed, need to be taken much further. And I think this is what's interesting about this period, is that it is exactly this period of ferment in which ideas of and phrases and slogans and so on are being tested out, and what had previously been fairly woolly and indeed fairly ambiguous sets of ideas now become much more clearly clarified. And this is where clause 4, I think, comes in to the debate. Now, the text of clause 4 is included in the readings. I've also included the revised edition, the Blairite edition from the 1990s. And I think there are a couple of things worth talking about in that document. We could have a very close textual analysis of it, and indeed in one of the articles that I cited earlier on, there is quite a close textual analysis of that document, and it talks about the language of fairness, of distribution, and the importance of the language of workers, both by hand and by brain. The clause 4 itself was written by Sidney Webb, and it reflects very much, I think, the Fabian ideal. Last week I talked about the nature of the Fabians and about the nature of their politics. And likewise, the main political program, Labour and the New Social Order, was also written by Sidney Webb. Now, the Fabian conception of socialism, I think, is much closer to the idea of the wartime economy. It's much closer to the idea of a very bureaucratic form of control. So when it talks about public ownership or nationalization, it's using the language of rationality. It's using the language of gas and water socialism, which the Fabians were identified with, particularly in London and in the municipalities. Above all, it's the idea of reform from above. And it doesn't, despite the idea of the new social order, it doesn't envisage anything revolutionary. It's a very gradualist set of ideas. And it doesn't, I think, have any conception that the working class as a class will take power. So this is implicitly quite bureaucratic. It's quite managerial. And it very clearly sits at odds with the type of movements which are then developing in Britain. It also sits very clearly at odds, I think, with the ideas of the Russian Revolution and with the ideas of workers' power. Now, why then did many people at the time regard this as a step forward? The Manchester Guardian's report describes the party taking an explicitly socialist direction. G.D.H. Cole, who was a former Guild socialist, Clement Attlee, who will be Labour leader later on, both talk about this document being explicitly socialist. They both argue that this conference is one where Labour makes a definite commitment to socialism. Now, I think that what Labour makes a commitment to at that time is a move away from liberalism, a purely representational form of politics, but I think it moves towards a form of Labourism, which is, in a sense, to accept the Labour movement's place in British society, to accept its place in British politics, and to now begin the idea of campaigning to become the government, no longer just a pressure group, but a party with a definite set of policies. But those policies definitely work within the framework of capitalism. They don't envisage not only revolutionary means to achieve them, so the Russian model of insurrectionism or of workers' power or of Soviets, those are not part of this schema at all. Indeed, in some of the other documents that I've provided you with, the report of the 1918 Labour Party conference, it is actually a full report. Again, it's actually a photocopy of the conference, so you will find it difficult. The only real way we can read it properly is, I'm afraid, to go to the LSE library where it's stored. But that and the other documentation from Arthur Henderson and from Ramsay MacDonald, his document entitled Parliament and Revolution, really, I think, sum up what to these people Clause 4 actually meant. Now, of course, what this raises is whether a document which in one era is defined in one way can take on a symbolic importance, so that for the comrades who in the 50s were arguing against Gateskill, the document did represent some sort of commitment to socialism. But its origins were clearly, I think, in terms of the Fabians, were very different. And I would suggest, given what we know about the rest of the conference, probably an attempt to head off much more radical positions which were then developing. Indeed, both Henderson and the Webbs and also Ramsay MacDonald had spent a considerable period in those years, 1917 to 1920, reorganizing the party, and indeed, in a sense, getting it ready for government, not only making it more respectable and more acceptable as a leading party, but demonstrating their constitutional credentials. So the very title of their publications, The Aims of Labour, Parliament and Revolution, all, I think, are designed not only to reassure an electorate, but also to reassure the capitalist class that this is not a revolutionary party, despite some of the rhetoric of their supporters. Now, the 1918 election, which was held in December of that year, did mark something of a step forward for Labour. It improved it gained 15 seats, and indeed it became the official opposition. This was because of splits in the Liberal Party. This period from 1914 to 1923-24 is actually a very fluid and indeed quite a crisis-ridden period in British politics. And the Liberal Party split, and what will happen in the succeeding years up until the late 20s is that sections of the Liberal electorate, but also Liberal activists and indeed Liberal MPs, will start to move towards the Labour Party. They'll gravitate there, and in a way will tend to have an influential role, particularly when Labour goes into government, as we will discover in the next couple of sessions, and you need experienced parliamentarians and indeed people to fill the positions. It's also a period of, I think, great industrial struggles, a period of great crisis in the British Empire. The industrial struggles, particularly in the post-war years, involving very key sections of the working class, the miners, the railway workers, transport workers. And these see quite militant struggles, but they also see significant defeats. And these too will find their reflection in the growth of the Labour Party and in its political development. But possibly one of the most significant features of this period is the development of the Hands Off Russia campaign, again, which demonstrates the sort of pressure that the organised working class can put on the Labour Party. It starts off as a campaign organised by the left and what will become the British Communist Party, but it finds an echo in the trade unions and indeed in the formation of a Council of Action in the summer of 1920 involving the TUC and the Labour leaders. You can see that this tells us something about the way that the Labour Party can reflect left-wing pressures. And so that although its leadership, Andrew Ramsay MacDonald, J.R. Clines, Henderson and so on, are all fairly conservative politicians and all fairly cautious, timid politicians, on occasions the sorts of pressures on them from their own members and from the wider working class movement can force them into opposing the actions of the coalition government and can indeed, make the move into quite a militant position. Now, the last couple of areas I want to look at, indeed, are perhaps some of the most important, is the formation of the Communist Party, and indeed the debates within that party, and then the debates within the Labour Party about the nature of that Communist Party, and indeed the nature of socialism. I've included a number of documents of discussions that were taking place among left-wing groups, some of whom would later form the Communist Party, others of them would remain within the general orbit of the Labour Party. And these discussions were really, I think, tell us a lot about how people on the left saw the Labour Party, and indeed whether it was a potential instrument for socialism. The debates were really about whether socialists should be either members of the Labour Party or should affiliate towards it, and in particular the nature of that party. Now, the key element, certainly for Lenin when he wrote about this, was the rather contradictory nature of the Labour Party as what he referred to as a bourgeois workers' party. And this goes back to the idea of the federal structure of the party, I think. It has deep connections with the trade unions. It also has a left organized in the ILP and as individual socialists. But it also has a leadership who Lenin characterizes as being bourgeois, as being simply part of the capitalist class. So this raises, I suppose, a question for people on the left. Is Labour a ready-made instrument for us to achieve socialism, or is it a site of struggle? Is it a battleground? And if it is a battleground, where do the instruments come? Where do the patterns come? Where do the forces come that can forge that new leadership, that can forge that new approach? And I think the discussions amongst both members of the Labour Party and amongst British communists are very instructive in this way. As I've said, this is a very fluid period, and the idea of a dividing line, which I raised between reformism and revolution, isn't clearly established. For example, in the 1922 election, 2 members of the CPGB are selected as Labour MPs and indeed are elected. And for a period in the 20s, it's quite possible to be a communist and to be selected as a Labour candidate, and indeed to be a delegate, to be both a Communist Party member and to be a delegate from a trade union to the Labour Party. And it's also very clear that there is ideological crossover, and many people who form the Communist Party are from the British Socialist Party. Others are from a grouping called the ILP Left, who will join the Communist Party at a later date after 1920. So the idea of the left, what constitutes the left, what are the boundaries on the left, I think are also very important. And also for us, in terms of where we see the main site now for any form of socialist struggle. The debates, Chris Williamson, for example, has a debate and has an article in today's Morning Star saying that the future of the left lies outside the Labour Party. Well, what I think the debates that were taking place on the left in the early 20s show is that the Labour Party is a fact which can't be wished away, and how we approach it and how we understand it, I think, are going to be very important. And I hope this is what these historical talks will get us to understand. I would then just like to, I suppose, the very quick conclusion about some concluding themes. They're not answers. They're more points for discussion, both when the comrades come in, but also in the recurring weeks. So my argument is about the definition of socialism and where Clause 4 stands in relation to that. Is nationalization socialism? Even with workers' control, is it socialism, or are we talking about something else, another conception, and in particular about the forces that initiate that? Is socialism carried out by parliament? Is it carried out by an extra parliamentary movement? Does it represent a different type of self-activity and self-emancipation? Is it a case of waiting for a series of Labour governments, or indeed waiting for a series of left-wing leaders? Particularly this issue of the role of the left in the Labour Party and the role of left leadership, I think, is important, because of the underlying question that we have is the recurrent failure of the left, and whether this represents some sort of original sin in the Labour left, or some sort of DNA in the Labour Party, or is it a failure of programme? Is it a failure of strategy? Is it a failure, above all, of our conception of what constitutes socialist politics? The other question, I suppose, is the impact of the Russian Revolution and the idea of boundaries, the idea that certain types of politics are acceptable within the Labour Party, other types of politics aren't. And again, how does that fit into our modern conceptions, particularly in terms of the witch hunt? Do some comrades have left views which are acceptable and other views which are not? Again, who draws up those rules? And my apologies, comrades, my screen has just gone dead. I'm just trying to get back in.
We can see you.
Okay, right, good. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. And in particular, I suppose this idea of defining the boundaries, and who does that definition? Who defines where the left is, and indeed the sort of levels of cooperation between comrades on the left? If Lenin said that communism was Soviets plus electricity, maybe Soviets plus Zoom nowadays, is socialism then simply nationalization and a Labour government? And I'd like to sort of look at this idea, particularly by the early 20s. The possibility of a Labour government is now quite a strong one. And then the last issue in terms of the boundaries is the one that did excite a lot of debate, both when the Communist Party was being formed, but is going to excite a lot of debate, I think, in the Labour Party and in the Labour left. And this is the issue of Parliament. This is the issue of what type of movement we would build in our relationship to Parliament and our relationship to government and indeed the state. The point about Clause 4 is it does argue in its very first section that the job of the Labour Party is to have a parliamentary party. And that would argue then that the essence of Labourism is parliamentary socialism. When Ralph Miliband took that title for his book, he was very keen to stress Parliament. He was very keen to stress constitutional legality being the central core of Labourism. So given the failures of Labour governments, given the failures of the Labour left, is that still an area that we need to debate, and indeed our relationship to that type of constitutionalism and that type of way of legitimating our politics? Anyway, I'll close now, and then we can open it up to discussion.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was fascinating, as I expected it might be. It's a very interesting subject, isn't it? Especially the discussion, is the Labour Party the vehicle for socialism? Can it be, or is it a battleground? I think that goes to the heart of the discussions we're having at the moment as well on the Labour left. I presume you're of the persuasion, as I am, that it's a battleground and that it cannot actually deliver socialism, but it is a very important area for socialists to get involved in. Okay, a few points before I bring in questions from the floor. Please raise your hand don't do it like this because I can't see you. Do it with the blue hand at the bottom of your screen. It says raise hand. I will then make you a panelist, like you've seen two comrades already up there, and we can then ask you. You can then ask your questions. A couple of comrades asked about that Verso series. Kevin, if you have a chance to look for a link or something while you're listening to questions, or we can put it out on Facebook later on. I quickly looked and I can't find it either. It's actually interesting in the sense that, well, I was going to just read that out quickly. Socialist Appeal now, who have launched the campaign for Clause 4 a couple of years ago and who brought it to conference floor, and now actually have abandoned that. They don't want to bring that back as soon as possible or whenever. They are now arguing for a Tony Benn quote, which is actually much better. It talks about that our needs and our rights cannot be fully realized under capitalism, where human values are subordinated to the demand for profit. Our aim is to abolish these obstacles, and as a socialist party, specifically would commit this, the Labour Party is a socialist party. We do not exist to manage capitalism. We stand for a democratic socialist society based upon the principle from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Now, I think that's a much better formulation than the original Clause 4, and it's worthwhile looking at that. As I said, it cannot actually be brought back to conference floor for a while. Nevertheless, I'll go quickly now to speakers from the floor. First one is Councillor Suga, and I have to spotlight you and unmute you. Hello, Suga.
Hello, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, comrades. It's a fantastic speech by Comrade Kevin Bean, and it is a very timely subject. We need to talk about the socialism back again, because the last 5 years it was around talking about Jeremy Corbyn. The most of the right-wingers and anti-communist and the socialist people are rallied against it. It is as a one-man army like Jeremy Corbyn. So we need to talk about the socialism, coming back to talk about the conception of theory rather than pointing towards the one person's. So my point, rather than focusing on the NHS, when I talk to the common people in this country, when they are talking against the rigid and left ideology, then I used to point out about NHS. I think that is one of the practical things we presented to this country, and we should be rallied around the NHS, which is the classic example of the socialist policy manifested in this country. And I don't think in this country 1% of the people is going to against the NHS. But what the right-wingers are doing is to background policy to thwart it and wreck it through the privatization and the failure of public ownership of the NHS. So I've been pointed out one of the CEO of a main CEO company in this country that the NHS is dooming and sinking, and the government is spending a lot of money, but it cannot be survived for a long time. So we need to think about how a capital cultures where we can work towards success. It is a big challenge for us within the constitutionalism, within the parliamentary democracy, how to build up the socialism. It is a big question in terms of the publicity of the NHS and the survivability of the NHS. Thank you, comrade.
Yeah. Me to go? Yeah, so my question was sort of linking back to last week's talk. By the way, lovely talk again, thank you very much. But linking back to last week's talk, I wonder, and then the questions about parliamentarianism and can you achieve socialism that way, I was wondering if there's ever been a group that that you would categorize as socialism from below that was also gradualist in approach. I'm thinking maybe of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Maybe, I mean, they say they want a revolution when it happens, but that revolution can only happen once everyone is happily educated and on board, sort of thing, is my take on what they say. So yeah, can you have a revolutionary gradualism that's socialism from below? Is a sort of a question. I'll mute myself.
Right. Right, are we there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Kevin. Long time no see. Thanks for the talk. I think, to some extent, clause 4. I mean, it's obviously written this way deliberately. Clause 4 can mean what you want it to mean. Because obviously it doesn't talk about workers' power or anything like that. But I think the importance of the Kennard-Blair struggle to get rid of clause 4 and Gates still before him was precisely to make the Labour Party safe for capitalism. It was intended to eliminate any possibility of socialism as part of the Labour programme. And I think that's the importance of even the 1918 clause 4, that it actually gave a voice for socialism within the party.
Yeah.
Sorry, comrades, I've been asked quite rightly, can comrades please introduce themselves when they start speaking?
Mike Kennard, geriatric Labour Party from Cambridge here now.
Okay, look, thank you. The next person is Alan Donovan, please.
Hi there. Sorry that it's not quite lined up properly. Yeah, Alan Donovan, South.
We can't really hear you. Sorry, comrade. Can you be a bit closer to the?
Yeah, sorry. Is that better?
Slightly better, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, the camera's not quite lined up. That's better. Yeah. Alan Donovan, Coulston, Croydon South. I'm very interested in the topic, especially the clause 4 situation. I think what Tina said, as far as the new Tony Benn point that was put forward, is very interesting. My question is, do you think that an opportunity was missed seriously with Jeremy Corbyn and the left over the last 5 years in not making a more positive attempt at conference to change back clause 4 to make much more in line with socialist aims and the last manifesto that was put forward, rather than just leaving it alone, mainly I think to try and appease the more right of the party, where possibly we should have been stronger. And following on from where you say about the whether you can change things socialist within the party, again on the same point, was Jeremy Corbyn and others at the left over the last few years again not as strong as they could have been by not making sure that we had automatic reselection brought in, so that we had the opportunity to so that local CLPs had the opportunity to put forward more active socialist MPs.
Here. Yes. Just quickly, I'm answering a question here quickly. The 3-year rule, now that means because that particular section of the rule book was discussed last year, it means it cannot be discussed again for another 3 years, which is very undemocratic. I'm trying to actually paste the full quote in here, but I've not managed it yet. I'll try to get to it in a second. Thank you, Alan. Next person to speak is Matthew Jones. Oops.
Thanks. Yeah,
yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. I just got this thing. So you're muted by host, so I'm unmuted myself. So yeah. Okay, no, I think the thing about this period, of course, is I think that Kevin raises quite a number of issues. I mean, first of all, obviously the key one of the nature of workers' power. You know, can it be achieved through Parliament? And I mean, quite clearly the answer is, and if you look at any actual revolution against the capitalists or anywhere where the working class has even got close to seizing power, the answer is clearly not. You know, you can see, you know, the working class actually evolves its own organs of power, which is what Soviets are. I mean, Soviet just means committee. You know, I mean, essentially just the organising committees for the working class in a given area, and clearly that's replicated, and you can see that anywhere. The working class, once the working class, you know, comes to the point of that sort of sharp conflict with the capitalists over the question of power, then it evolves its own organs, contrary to those of the state. And you can see also, of course, that the process of the organs of the state, of course, are also there. There's a concession, if you like, to the working class, and they concede. Obviously, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, a whole series of things. Votes for women, for a start. Votes for the rest of the working class that weren't enfranchised. All these things are conceded. Even, you know, the right of the rights to organise, certainly a degree of higher wages in many sectors, because the ruling class is clearly terrified of you know, the impact of the revolution, which happens everywhere. But I mean, obviously more so in the rest of Europe than in Britain. I mean, I think the problem is also, you have to say that the political level and the political degree of organisation is much higher in the rest of Europe, in Germany, France, in, you know, Italy, in other, you know, major countries in Europe than it is in Britain, and you know, and that has always, in fact, been the case until quite recently. Whereas, you know, if you like, it's fallen back towards British levels as opposed to Britain going forward. And if you look at, you know, say the Comintern, the British CP is quite clearly seen as the worst CP in Europe. You know, both in terms of its political level and its level of support in the working class, which is only right, actually. If you look at the whole business in terms of, as I say, the questions of the organs of the state, you can quite clearly see in things like Parliament and councils and so on. In a sense, it's almost designed to suck people in to bits of the state, and it does it very successfully. I mean, you can see it. You know, you go into if you go into my Labour Party, I mean, you can quite clearly see, and these people are just there. The right wing are just there because they want to run, you know, bits of the state. They're not no interest in the working class whatsoever, other than they might vote for them. You know, other than that, they really don't care. And you know, they're happily employed, like, you know, the cops and the bailiffs and so on and so forth, if there's any problem. So I mean, in those terms, I mean, it's a sharp question. It's a sharp pointed question, but it's not merely British. I mean, it has to be seen in the world scale, and at a European scale. And you know, all of this stuff is happening with the background of the rest of the world, and not merely in a British scale or scene or whatever else. And in fact, as I say, Britain tends to trail everywhere else. You know, so I think you have to look at it like that.
Thanks, Matthew. Kevin, would you like to come back in? Or we've got 4 more people asking questions. Oh, by the way, we're trying to finish at about 7:30. So Kevin, do you want to come in now or later?
I'll come in now, Tina. Also forget.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, some good questions, as ever. I think Suga's hit the nail on the head, and it really links in with some of the things that Alan Donovan asked, which is the focus on, I suppose, one man. There was, you know, one of the criticisms I would make of the Corbyn campaign is a sort of tendency to just think that all we need is one leader, you know, a messiah almost. And, you know, in that way, if we get a leader, then the job is done. And that sort of focus on not really building a wider movement, or I think something that Suga, referred to, is building perhaps a wider socialist movement and a wider socialist culture in that way. So I think that one of the failures of the Corbyn period was that the focus on leadership meant that it was very much a case of follow the leader and relying upon the leader to do the right thing. And, I'm not sure that the leader always did do the right thing. I mean, Alan, in a sense, answered his own questions. Yes, Jeremy Corbyn should have been as militant in opposing the right wing as they were militant in opposing him. And with things like open selection, he should have been as militant in defending and advancing that as the Parliamentary Labour Party and the right wing were committed to holding on to their positions. It's a bit like the old phrase, it's a cliche, but the left preaches the class war and the Tories practice it. And the people who were carrying out the civil war in the Labour Party were the right, and the left were actually quite pacifistic. We were often very timid in our approach, and in a sense, we almost put our heads on the block and said cut. So I think that Alan was really right on that, and I think Suga's point about focusing on leadership, and you see, we'll get this as well historically. Ramsay MacDonald became leader of the Labour Party in 1922. He launched a challenge to J.R. Clines, and he got the support of the ILP, particularly Clydesiders, who represented the left of the Parliamentary Party. And the reason why MacDonald, who clearly wasn't as far left as the Clydesiders, got their support was because of his reputation from opposing the First World War, but also because of their focus was really on leadership. Their focus was on getting a good leader, not about building a movement. And I think that that's a very important set of ideas. And I think if there is a recurrent theme that we will get throughout these talks, and since I'm writing them, maybe I'll have something to do with that. But there will be a recurrent theme, which is perhaps an obsession with a leader, and then of a type of loyalty to that leader. There's nothing wrong with loyalty to principles. There's nothing wrong in supporting good left-wing leaders. But what it does is to take away the political agency and the political dynamic from our movement, from us. And I think that's quite important. Richard asked a very important question about socialism from below, and I have to say I actually do know some comrades from the SPGB. There are a few of them in and around Liverpool, and in a way they remind me of those sort of religious groups who are the descendants, say, of 17th century Puritans who are keeping the flag flying. In one way, I do agree with them that socialism must come from below, that socialism is a democratic movement without having a majority of the population, without without democracy, without freedom of expression, without active involvement, then the sort of socialism I envisage, which is a transfer of real power, can't actually occur. It can't be done by a stroke of the pen. It can't be done by the most well-meaning of socialist parliamentarians or councillors. So in that sense, they're quite correct. And it means that we have to develop a socialist culture. We have to develop support for socialism. And that, is just the beginning. It's like the ideas that were, for example, developed. German social democracy, which I often make reference to, is a good example of that. But it is about a movement that expresses the will of the mass of the majority. Now, the way that we do that and how we organize for that I don't think it's through passivity, and I don't think it's through just necessarily selling magazines and newspapers. It's through active politics. It's building up a socialist culture and socialist organization. And in particular, the idea of organizing through the labor movement, through trade unions, through workers' organizations, instruments of power, and above all, things that would give us a sense of confidence and a sense that we have the ability to run and transform society. It's rather like Suga's point on the collective that's expressed in the National Health Service, or the collective that's expressed in any number of areas of life. And I think that that's, that's need to be built on there. Mike, so it's nice to see you. I think it's getting on close for around about 40-something years since we last met. So glad you're looking so well. I think you're right about the symbolic value. I'm not sure that removing or Clause 4 made Labour safe for capitalism. Labour was safe for capitalism at the time of Ramsay MacDonald. Labour was safe for capitalism it really, throughout its history. So the existence of a particular clause, I think, isn't important. I think it's a symbolic value. Labour governments had, the Wilson government of the 60s and then later the 70s had Clause 4, and that that didn't restrict it, or it didn't enable it in any way. But I do agree about its symbolic importance, and that's why the battles over it were so important, and why the battle for a new Clause 4, setting out a clear set of socialist aims, I think is essential in that way. Just on Matt's point, I would agree with that largely. I don't think there's anything that I would disagree in there. I think the importance of internationalism, and in particular the importance of learning from other struggles, I think is important. One of the problems in the British movement in general is a certain type of either parochialism or exceptionalism. And I am depressed by the idea that we're now leveling down to a particular level. On the other hand, as comrades know from these talks, and they'll know from other, activities, there's also a good British tradition as well. And that's the important point about learning from history and discussing that history. Above all, bringing that history, I think, to wider notice in the movement. Quite a lot of people don't really know much of the history of the Labour Party, and they certainly won't learn it if they go onto the Labour Party website. And that's why I think these sessions and sessions like them, organised by other comrades, are very important.
Thank you, Kevin. The next person to speak is Bob. I'll unmute you now. Fire away.
Okay, Bob Davis from Swansea Labour Left Alliance and West Wales Labour Left Alliance. Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Just a couple of things. Firstly, on the role of the Fabians in relation to Clause 4, the original Clause 4. I find it very interesting the more I read about this organisation and the work of the Webs in particular, the role they actually played in the build-up to Clause 4. I mean, they were back in, societies actually back in British imperialist war in South Africa, in the Boer War, I believe. They certainly backed the 1914 and 1918 imperialist war. They're propping up liberals a lot of the time. So their perspective to me strikes as social liberalism rather than socialism. So that's my first point. Which brings me neatly on to the point about Clause 4 in 1918 and its limitations. If you look at Clause 4, there's certainly on one level quite a couple of attractive parts to it, the control of the means of production and workers having fruits of their labour. But it also strikes me what is absent. And we're talking about control and power and who owns power within society. There's no clear statement, for example, on fighting for socialism. against capitalism. I think a couple of comrades have already made the point. There's no clear statement on internationalism. I mean, socialism isn't a domestic objective, it crosses borders. And getting back again, so I think it was the first comrade who made the point about the National Health Service. So we should certainly defend the National Health Service, but to me, I think, you know, to fight for socialism, it's more about challenging power struggles, not just in Britain, but in the world. And of course, in Britain, you got things like the monarchy. You know, why can't Clause 4 include Republican demands, the monarchy, the House of Lords, the abolition of the Privy Council, for example? And these are fundamental if you're talking about, you know, an idea of what the working class is trying to actually strive for.
Thank you, Bob. The next person to speak is Adam Booth. Oh.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Well, thank you, Tina, for organising, and thank you, Kevin, for the fantastic speech and the outlining of the Russian Revolution and its impact on the Labour Party. Yeah, my name is Adam. I'm an activist with Socialist Appeal, and I've actually been helping coordinate the Labour for Clause 4 campaign nationally, along with Rob Sewell, editor of Socialist Appeal. And I just wanted to touch upon some of the points that we've raised in the campaign and that Tina's also mentioned, because I think the reason that we set up the campaign was obviously the dramatic transformation.
You want me to go on time before?
Sorry, someone else is speaking there.
I've muted him. Sorry, you go.
Sorry. Yeah, there's obviously the massive transformation that's taken place inside the Labour Party as a result of Jeremy Corbyn and the Corbyn movement, more importantly. And obviously the crisis of capitalism in 2008, which you know, has shown the failure of the market, and subsequently, obviously that's been emphasized by this current crisis, which is a capitalist crisis. It's not just a pandemic crisis. And it's shown the failure of privatization, of outsourcing. We've seen the collapse of Carillion, all of these sorts of things. Public ownership massively rising in support, even the majority of Tories favouring the nationalisation of the railways. And we felt it was important, therefore, to bring this question of public ownership back as a debate inside the Labour Party, across the Labour movement. And that's why the campaign was set up. And the reason we decided to push for the original Clause 4 was because it did, despite its limitations, encapsulate the idea of common ownership. You know, that was at the heart of Clause 4, and that's what's really at the heart of the debate now, is what kind of ownership do we have over the means of production. And it also has an enormous symbolic value for Labour members, because of course this was not just any old clause. This was a clause that was abolished by Tony Blair as part of his new Labour project, and therefore to bring it back would signify the death of Blairism. It would signify an end to the Blairite New Labour project of privatisation. So that's why the campaign pushed for that version, which received 62% of support from CLP delegates at last year's Labour conference, and was blocked only by the trade union delegates. Actually, if it hadn't been for that, it would have been restored at last year's conference. Now, in terms of going forwards, that motion, of course, as I said, it was blocked and therefore it didn't pass. However, the NEC did promise, as part of that debate, that they would set up a working body to review Clause 4 and to look into a new wording, which is something that many of the unions have also said they're in favour of, like the CWU and the Bakers Union, who also supported the Clause 4 campaign and who still support it. And obviously you've seen in the last leadership election, you had Rebecca Long Bailey and, more importantly, Richard Bergen pushing for the idea of a new Clause 4. And I think Richard Bergen summed it up very well when he said we need to put public ownership back into the DNA of our party by having a new Clause 4. So if they think that we can have a campaign around this, then surely we can carry on campaigning around this and not let some sort of bureaucratic rule about the amount of years that have been taken, need to go by until we can discuss it again at conference. I think on the basis of big events, of the big movements taking place, we can put this back on the agenda, and I think we should. And the Tony Benn amendment that we're proposing now, I think is even more in line with the times, because it directly points the finger at capitalism as being to blame and calls for Labour to be a socialist party. And I think it's really important that we push for these programmatic points, because at the end of the day, I think what's really failed with the momentum and with the Corbyn project was the fact that it didn't base itself around a program. The best parts of the Corbyn movement were in 2017 with the manifesto, with the bold public ownership policies that were put forward. And that's what's really failed with momentum. And a lot of the Labour left at the moment is that they don't base themselves on the politics and the program and the policies, but simply think it's an organizational question. And so therefore, I think it's very important that we as the Labour left, as we as socialists and Marxists in the Labour Party, put the program first and foremost in these struggles that are taking place, because it's the program that's going to rally people, that's going to mobilize people, that we're going to use to attack the Starmer right wing that's mobilizing obviously at the moment and trying to clear out the Corbyn movement. And I think just to end, like, I think, Kevin, you've really well outlined how it was the Russian Revolution, it was the World War I, the crisis of capitalism then, that led to the radicalization in the Labour Party, that led to the original Clause 4 being formulated. And we're now in a period, I think, similar to that. I think we're far more in a period similar to World War I than we are to World War II, in the sense that what we're going to have at the end of this pandemic is not going to be a boom like the post-war boom. It's going to be a deep crisis of capitalism, and socialist ideas, bold socialist ideas, are going to be firmly on the agenda. They're going to be finding a big echo. And I think, therefore, we have to push this point in trying to rebuild the Labour left. We have to push the programme, the bold socialist policies. And that's what we're trying to do with the Labour for Clause 4 campaign and the Benn Amendment. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for all the comments.
Thanks, Adam. That was interesting. Thank you. Anthony Brain, but could comrades please keep it a little bit shorter now, if that's possible? We're trying to finish at 7:30, which is probably not going to happen. But if you could 3 minutes each, please. Thank you. Anthony? You can only
I'm from Birmingham, England. I'm going to keep it very brief. I'm going to talk about the relationship between Stalinism and social democracy and nationalisation. I mean, the thing is, the whole point of is to get rid of capitalism. It's encourage private property for profit and all those distractions. The Russian Revolution forced the Social Democrats to move a lot more left, to move in that direction democratically. The difference between reform and revolution is reforms are in the favour of capitalism, and think they're overthrown capitalism. We've seen it today. Due to the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, put the form of Stalinism and not capitalist restoration. But what they did after the severe crisis of Socialism after '89, factories and all the defeats in Britain, and the capitalists emerged in most of the worker states in East Europe and Russia. They had capitalist restoration in East Germany and in Kosovo, but they didn't do it in all. They didn't put it off in East Europe. I mean, most importantly, they were defeated in Russia. The rise of the Putin with the bureaucracy going back to Stalinism was a major defeat for the capitalists. But in that framework, it's like they keep that in the Social Democratic Labour Party, because they tried to make try social democracy. They couldn't do it because of the chick to the left of the working and middle class. And how they got away with it was the crisis of Stalinism. But now Labour Party is going more social democratic. So he's in involved with Stalinism and social democracy. But part of the reason Russia survived as a war is there was the political revolution throughout Tenement Square against the bureaucracy that stopped the market reforms and they had to buy the working class by 300 million jobs. So the debate between the fight against capitalism, Stalinism and social democracy ultimately want the working class in full political power and running society. But you can't go further to defend the gains of the working class. You have the situation of a rock-tide revolution, reforms of social democracy, and generating social full workers' democracy.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Pat Byrne next. I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay, team. Thanks very much. This is Pat Byrne from Labour International constituency. and I'm based in Brazil. I just wanted to say quickly on the question of whether Parliament can be used to, you know, be a major part of the struggle for socialism, whether it could be, you know, a key part of it. I don't think we've written the book yet. There's all sorts of possibilities in the future struggles, and I think anybody who thinks that they know the future or tries to tell you they know the future is belying their own past, because we've all been through things that we thought we wouldn't. I mean, who would have thought that we'd have had a left leader like Corbyn, and we'd have had a left-wing shadow cabinet with left-wing people as shadow defence, shadow treasury, shadow home secretary, and so on. I mean, it never had happened in the history of the party. And this is perhaps early in the crisis. We don't know what's going to happen out of this Great Depression that seems to be coming after the coronavirus. So I think we shouldn't rule out things. One of the problems we've had is that the left in Britain and internationally have got very confused about the whole question of Soviets versus Parliament. And I haven't got time to go into what happened in the Russian Revolution, but it was a matter of circumstances that it happened that way. But actually, Soviets themselves are no panacea. The Soviets themselves very quickly degenerated after the Russian Revolution. They turned to being very bureaucratic bodies, delegates from local Soviets to regional Soviets to central Soviets, and they actually became very bureaucratized. What we need to do, I think, is we need to root and branch, come forward with proposals to democratize the state in Britain and Parliament and everything else. And the left hasn't done that generally because they've been held back by thinking, well, maybe we should go for Soviets. But I don't think Soviets has ever got an echo. And I think we've got to deal with the reality as it is now. The last point I wanted to make was about the Clause 4 campaign. You might remember that Mrs. Thatcher, when she was asked about what was her biggest success, you know, when she'd retired, and she didn't say, you know, getting down inflation, beating the unions, defeating Galtieri in the Falklands, or whatever, any other things, privatization or whatever. She said it was getting a Labour Party to abandon the principle of socialism. And what that tells me is that they are afraid of the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is actually it's a kind of dialectically, it's a kind of contradictory role. It's a pillar of society, but it's not a stable pillar because of the fact that we have democracy in the party, we've got the trade unions affiliated and so on. And so therefore, anything can happen in the future of the Labour Party, it's up to us. Now, I happen to, when Tony Blair campaigned, you know, to get rid of Clause 4, we on the left organised a big Defend Clause 4 campaign. I happened to be on the National Committee of that at the time. And we held debates all over the country, and we had votes at the end of those debates. I think it was about 55 big debates, and we won every single one of those debates, except for one. There was only one that we lost. But what was interesting was that we had so many party members, trade unions and so on, who said that they were not happy with the old Clause 4. And the biggest question they raised was about the fact that it was so vague on the question of control. That, you know, because it talks about the most popular form of administration, blah, 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 which doesn't mean much. And so you ended up with a situation where the right were able to live with Clause 4 for most of the time, and they were able to introduce nationalisation after the Second World War. Attlee himself explicitly said the workers were not ready to be on the boards of those companies. And it's very interesting himself that that Webb, you know, the guy that Kevin in his exit speech talked about from the Fabians, he went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and he became so enamored of Stalin's version of socialism that he wrote a huge book about it. That just shows you the top-down view of socialism that they had, whereas I think we would be much more nowadays in favour of a participatory democracy model, and I think that's what I think people want. And so I hope that I like Ben's proposal, but I'd like it maybe even tightened up to have explicitly in there that the workers, the customers, and so on will be in the leading role within those industries and not civil servants as we have today. Thanks.
Thank you. Next person is Mike Hogan. I'll unmute you now. Oh, you've done it already. Go on.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Mike Hogan. I'm an activist in Socialist Appeal, just as Adam was before. I also was one of the delegates at Labour Party conference who seconded one of the constitutional amendments on Clause 4. But I want to talk about the campaign we run, and just on the back of Pat's points about workers' democracy, because within that campaign, we saw it as a campaign of raising socialism and raising socialist ideas, because as somebody who was in the Labour Party and returned to the Labour Party when Corbyn came in, enthused by Corbyn, but also coming in there to defend Corbyn against the right wing. One of the things that I thought was a negative at that time was that the idea of socialism was really sort of diluted. And we, comrades will know that, some people defended Jeremy Corbyn on the basis that he was no more than a Scandinavian social democrat. And so so I thought that, one of the things is that socialism in the past, it was much clearer in the 70s, the 80s, about what the ideas of socialism was, about the ideas of nationalisation. And what we had was, apart from one or two nationalisations that made sense, like rail and so on, that we didn't have an idea of nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy, i.e. of socialism, of proper socialist ideas, as opposed to capitalism. I think that also what was important was tackling this idea and squashing this idea of Blairism, of the PFI, of the Private Finance Initiative, and the way that had gone through the party and became party policy. We actually had comrades in Socialist Appeal expelled from the Labour Party because they refused to say they supported the market economy. Such was it run through the party in such a way. But in the debates that we had around the country, we did talk about the ideas of workers' democracy. I was one of the speakers in Liverpool and the Northwest who went to our meetings on Clause 4. And one of the things, a couple of things that I stressed at those meetings was, one, that this was not a theoretical point. This is not a point that we just put it on our party card, put it in our back pocket and forget about it, that we should act on this and act upon socialist ideas. The other point was that we didn't want nationalisation as the same as in 1945. That what we wanted was workers' democracy. I in particular pointed to the way that the National Coal Board was in no sense a socialist venture, and they proved that quite graphically. And this was during the campaign, was the anniversary, with the horrendous scandal at Aberfan, where they were completely out of touch with working class communities and the working class. So one of the points that we raised at all of these meetings was the importance of workers' democracy, the importance of workers' control and democratic workers' control and management. In other words, getting back to proper socialist ideas and the workers, raising the ideas of the workers running the economy, and in fact of the workers, beyond that, the workers running the state as a workers' state, rather than a bourgeois state and a capitalist state. These were ideas that we were able to raise within the Labour Party, able to raise within these meetings, looking at and attracting people on the basis of looking at Clause 4. And we did raise it. There was an issue about, the original word, and which is vague. I have to admit that it is vague. But we could put into that whatever meaning that we were prepared to put into that. We put into that the ideas of workers' democracy, the ideas of workers' control. But the point was to get it onto the agenda rather than having discussion. And really pleased that Tina has shared the new wording that we're putting forward, because we want to debate around that wording. That we could see changes to that wording or tightening up or whatever. But it really nails on that in this society we need the nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy. We need the workers running society. That is the solution to the crisis that we face at the present moment. And that would be a rallying call for socialism, for proper what socialism means to me which is an end to capitalism. It doesn't mean a nicer, gentler, kinder form of capitalism. It means an end to capitalism, an end to the agony that we're facing day after day, and that, you know, that working people on this planet are facing, you know, day after day and year after year after year. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I've got two more speakers from the floor, and then we have to wind up to get Kevin a chance to come back. Rick Simon, please. I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, everybody, and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks very much, Tina, and thanks to Kevin for a very interesting talk. I agree a lot with what Adam Booth said, although I'm not associated at all with Socialist Appeal, but that there are indeed very interesting historical parallels with the situation leading up to the adoption of Clause 4, what might be called war socialism during the First World War, accompanied by big social changes with a degree of a shift of wealth more towards working people, a big increase in trade union membership, and obviously the Russian Revolution that to help to create the conditions for the adoption of Clause 4. But at the same time, the 1918 Constitution built in the control of the Labour Party by the trade union bureaucracy. That was, although Clause 4 was there to sort of accepting the existence of socialists within the Labour Party, much of the rest of the Constitution, the following clause in the Constitution basically articulated radical liberal demands. There is considerable limitations. But now we're in a situation of what you might call COVID socialism, I suppose, where obviously the state has had to step in and intervene on a huge scale in order to prevent the collapse of society from a medical perspective. And that highlights something that I think has been completely absent from this discussion, which is and we need to avoid just rerunning the sort of the old debates from a century ago. This crisis now is an economic crisis, but it's also an ecological crisis, and that combination of factors needs to be acknowledged, and the policies that we develop need to be built into in terms of developing some sort of eco-socialist society. And while we can, say yes, we want the control of the commanding heights of the economy and so on, we have to build a movement that can actually get us somewhere there. And I think during this crisis, we have begun to see some, embryonic aspects of that, in the way that people are sort of self-regulating, looking after people within their community, and all of these sorts of things that perhaps means that the way people will behave after this crisis has passed will lead them to question the foundations of the system that we have. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And last final speaker is Charlie Pritchett. You're unmuted.
Hello, I'm from Norwich South CLP, and I just basically wanted to talk about how the sort of like the necessity of like the having the unity of production, distribution, and exchange within the Clause 4, but which is put into a kind of more concrete context, I suppose, if you like, in the Tony Benn Clause 4, where it explicitly talks about the nationalization of the banks and finance houses. But essentially, we need to sort of like stress that we can't really sort of like stress this enough, that that you can't have like sort of that socialism is unrealizable without having control of both the means of of like these kind of separate spheres. So like you need to sort of it's a matter of actually controlling like the necessity of actually controlling the sort of the circulation of capital, both you know, in both forms, as you know, as like the production of commodity capital and also of money capital. So, and you know, the necessity of having banks, like not just like, you know, for like industries under workers' control, but you know, say for example, if you know you have you know, a left Labour government elected, then it's, you know, the money kind of required to implement any sort of like, you know, radical reforms, you know, the you know, bank, you know, the sort of, you know, the bank, you know, the like bankers and the capitalists, you know, they will have a kind of multitude of like mechanisms through which, you know, they can you know, they can essentially sort of strip, you know, through suddenly send their capital elsewhere, and the kind of they can move their assets abroad to through sort of through the havens, and that I think, you know, and as Mike Hogan was saying earlier, it's not simply you know, having clause 4 back. It's not just simply about having a kind of nicer capitalism. You know, there's no way that they'll actually, you know, that they'll just, you know, let, you know, a Labour government, for example, like borrow money out of their own goodwill. And you know, the important, but you know, it's the importance of clause 4 as being a standard for leadership that I think is particularly important. That, you know, with, you know, as you know, and the only way you can really sort of ensure the commitment of one of the, I mean, sort of, you know, a vital way you can actually ensure the sort of the commitment of a leadership is by implementing measures like open selection and like having MPs on a worker's wage, because, you know, it's about, you know, that is a real sort of you know, having leaders who are actually willing to take to sort of, you know, to actually take them, you know, because, you know, not because they want to get, you know, they want like a nice comfortable life settling into an official position, but they're actually committed to the fundamental transformation of society.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah. I think I have to wind you up now because we're.
That's fine.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Cheers. Okay, I'll bring in Kevin now to sum up and reply to some questions. I've unmuted you, but I think you've muted yourself again. Okay.
Yeah, here I am. Yeah, I've done it now. Okay. Well, thanks for all the contributions. I think some very good ones there. I won't be able to answer all the points, but you know, they were, I think, all very relevant and very good. Just on Bob's point about what socialists should be fighting for now, and in particular the limitations of the web's not just social liberalism, but very clear pro-imperialism. One of the comrades later on, I think, referred to the web's support for Stalinism in their book Soviet Communism, you know, a new form of civilization. And it was very clear that the sort of bureaucratic approach, you know, really encapsulated what they were about. So they weren't just, I think, social liberals, they were very clearly pro-capitalist. And indeed, you know, in some senses, quite elitist. Their views on eugenics, you know, for example, are, you know, fairly horrendous. You make an important point, Bob, about what the rest of the program should include, and in a way, it links into some of the other questions about what should a modern statement of aims of a socialist party include. And I think that elements in bourgeois democracy, particularly raising the issue of the monarchy, the democratic republic, the nature of parliament, it's partly to link in with the point that Pat Byrne made about, in a sense, where do we go from here, starting where we are now. One of the key issues is that if there were a Labour government to be elected, the type of obstruction that would be put in its way and in particular the role of the unelected elements in the state. And the focus on the monarchy isn't just because we object to the money, or we object to the sort of rather childish way that British citizens, in fact British subjects, are regarded. It's also because it's a limitation of the idea of democracy. So the battle for socialism is also a battle for democracy, and I think that came out very well. So any new clause 4 has to look at the nature of the capitalist state and has to put forward democratic demands as well in its general program. I think Adam explained very well the position of the comrades there, but there's one sort of key point I'd say about the heart of the debate, and I would agree that it is a question of program, and it isn't solely a question of organization. It's not solely a question of getting more left-wing people onto the Executive Committee of Constituencies or on the NEC, or more left-wing MPs. It's the nature of the program, and that links into not just the economic program, but the political program that we've just been referring to as well. I also think that you're right, Adam, about the depth of the crisis and about the importance of an alternative program, and particularly raising that alternative now. So I think, you know, we have some, you know, we share some degree about the sort of tasks that are ahead of us. And in particular, I think the importance of campaigning for that, and not just to allow the 3-year rule, you know, to get in the way. You know, the points that both you and Mike made about the importance of the debate around clause 4, you know, I think are perfectly valid. You know, we might disagree about the wording of clause 4, we might be critical of it, but it does give us an opportunity to raise some of those fundamental questions. Anthony, I had problems hearing you because of the reception, but I think you did make some quite important points about Stalinism, and particularly the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. And you know, I will look possibly at that when we get up into the sort of 40s and the 50s in that way. And again, I think the nature of the Soviet state and its both its sort of pole of attraction as showing an alternative to capitalism, but also its very clear degeneration into something that was far removed into a type of dictatorship, you know, means that its legacy was very ambiguous, and particularly certainly in from the 50s onwards, I think it was an issue which held us back. In many ways, it was quite positively counter-revolutionary in that way. Pat, I think your point about the Soviets and Parliament is well taken, and I think that the idea of democratic demands and the idea of the right of recall and all of those elements of a democratic program are important. If there's for those of us who've been in the socialist movement for a while, if there's a criticism I would make of my own activity and lots of other comrades, is that we've often tended to either ignore those questions or not regard them as being of sort of first-rate importance. And I think it is quite easy to simply say, I support the Russian Revolution, I support Soviets, without, in a sense, understanding what they really mean, which is why I suggested that comrades look at some of those documents about the debate about what Soviets were doing, and in particular the way that you might use Parliament as a platform to advance you know, a socialist movement, but also to make demands about bourgeois democracy, not simply to dismiss it, but to argue that the struggle for you know, bourgeois democratic change is also an integral part of the you know, the fight for socialism. I thought in particular this idea of not, in a sense, a lot of the future being unwritten is quite important. Although we were talking about the past, but of course the discussion very rapidly came up to the present day, which indeed is what I you know, expected and hoped that it would do. Mike, you made some quite important points about workers' democracy, and you know, again, I fully agree with those, and in particular the way that both in clause 4, the old clause 4, the idea of popular control was left very vague. But I think workers' democracy is really fundamental to the socialist movement, and I think I explained that in my opening talk, but perhaps in some of the responses there. Just to conclude about with Rick's point about the historical parallels and war socialism, I think we are entering into a, you know, a new and I mean, an interesting period in the sense of the Chinese curse. I think, though, that capitalism as a system has been overripe for transformation since the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, there's an argument that the imperialist war was really a product of that overripeness. And above all, the ability of the working class to take power and to run society was pretty evident in the richer countries of the world, including Britain, including Germany. And what we see in these historical debates is evidence of that. So in a way, we've been waiting a century for this change, and it's overripe, and all of the symptoms of the crisis and the deepening of that crisis show that. So in a sense, the transition has been implicit in that way. And so campaigning and organizing for that and for that type of workers' power is really important. Just on Charlie's last point about finance and about the unity of production, exchange and distribution, that's correct. And any alternative statement of aims for a socialist party must start with that economic basis. But it should also, I think, link into these wider political questions about who controls and about the issue of power. The classic socialist programs like the Erfurt program in Germany in the 1890s did that. The Bolshevik program did it. And I think that clause 4 was an attempt to head off that sort of development of that sort of program in the British Labour Party. If we look at what's going to happen with the left in the next couple of decades, we will see attempts to do that all the time. And I suppose our task as the left in the Labour Party is to build that left, but more importantly is to build a Marxist current, to build a current that it really is committed to the transformation of society, and that will involve, I think, really quite fundamental and revolutionary change. Anyway, comrades, that's me. That allows you time to go off to other meetings and events. So thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you very much, Kevin.